The U.S. President Donald Trump has held his first meeting in 25 years between U.S. and Syrian leaders after saying he'll lift sanctions on the country. Mr. Trump has been touring the Middle East, where he's also announced a ceasefire between the U.S. and Yemen's Houthi rebels. Dr. A.J. Hellyer is a senior associate fellow at London's Royal United Services Institute for Defence and Security Studies, and he joins me now from Cairo. Hi there. Now, firstly, how do you view the U.S. re-engaging with Syria by lifting sanctions on the country and the fact that Donald Trump has today met face-to-face with Syria's interim leader Ahmed al-Sharaa?
Oh, thank you for having me on your program. So actually, it's less of a re-engagement and more of a disengagement. The sanctions were put into place to apply pressure on the Assad regime. The Assad regime is gone. And I think that what you see very clearly from the Trump administration is recognition that if Syria is to be a place that can recover, its economy can recover, and it can be a more contributing member to the region, then the sanctions just aren't going to help in that regard. Turkey and Saudi obviously lobbied quite heavily in support of this removal of sanctions. The Israelis lobbied heavily against that. Of course, the Israelis have invaded and occupied Syrian territory now for several decades and increased that over the past few months. They were not keen on the sanctions being lifted, but the team of Syria's President al-Sharaa seems to have succeeded in convincing their allies not only in the region but also in Washington D.C. And here are the results.
Yes, and how might the short to medium term impacts of the lifting of these sanctions be for Syria? Because we saw the likes of people, hundreds or perhaps thousands celebrating on the streets of Damascus. So it must be quite the news for Syrians there.
Absolutely. So the continuation of the sanctions made it very difficult to imagine that there could be any type of economic recovery for Syria at all. Okay, so this isn't a guarantee, the lifting of the sanctions, if indeed it's a full lifting, because what Trump indicated yesterday was that these would be complete liftings of the sanctions, not suspensions. And that's a very important point. If these are suspensions, it's not going to engender the same sort of business environment where investors feel that they can invest safely. But if they're a complete lifting of sanctions, then yes, indeed, that's a very big deal. The Saudis have already said they're going to put money in. The Turks have already made it clear that they're doing investments in Syria, and there'll be other countries in the region as well. So I think potentially it's a really big move. Of course, there are still obstacles that remain for Syria. They still have to manage the Kurdish question in the north. They also have to manage the Israeli strikes in the south and the occupation of Syrian territory in the south, which is incredibly destabilizing. But the sanctions were definitely a very big obstacle to any sort of recovery.
Yes.
And those hopefully.
Yes, and we know that Donald Trump is a deal maker. He's not going to do this for nothing. So where does he think the U.S. stands to benefit from this?
Well, so far there hasn't been any indication that there's going to be, huge American investment into Syria. Having said that, that could very easily change. I think that probably more importantly on the transactional level is that it builds more of a relationship between Washington, D.C. and Riyadh, as well as Ankara, where, of course, there is, especially in the Riyadh and the Gulf more generally, there's quite a lot of business opportunities for the Trump administration, which has been very, very clear in terms of the announcements yesterday and today. But I think it was more, generally speaking, I think it was more of if Syria is kept under these sanctions, there's no way it can recover, which means that it's going to be a place that actually invites destabilization. Under this new interim government led by President al-Sharaa, it's very clear that there won't be room for Iranian influence. If the sanctions are lifted, it removes leverage from the Russians. who were trying to, rebuild a certain foothold in Syria. So I think it works. The biggest question, frankly, around the sanctions was whether or not the Trump administration would withstand the lobbying in D.C. from within the Republican Party that was looking to actually keep the sanctions and was not interested in normalizing with Syria. And of course, from Netanyahu's government in Israel that was very clearly lobbying in this regard to keep the sanctions in. But it seems that the Trump administration, at least on this question, has decided, no, this is what we're going to do.
Yes, it's been quite the show so far for the president and his reception that he's got in Saudi Arabia. Now that this has happened, we have had these big deals being signed, $142 billion worth of arms. How significant is this in the context of the regional power balance?
I don't know if it's in terms of the deals. I'm not sure that there's much that's changed in that regard, but I think that you have to keep in mind how the region is unfolding and has been unfolding for quite some time. So, for example, the idea that the United States would, for example, assist in civilian nuclear energy in Saudi without a normalization deal between Riyadh and Tel Aviv was really, not something people were thinking about a few years ago. Things have changed, and things have changed because the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran has de-escalated in terms of the tension, not just with Saudi Arabia, but Iran's relationship more generally with the GCC, including with the United Arab Emirates, which was very concerned about Iranian influence, still is, but not to the same extent that it once was. And also when it comes to the relationship between Riyadh and DC, normalization with the Israelis is, in the deep freeze. Israel's war on Gaza, the destruction of Gaza and starvation and famine, all of that plays very badly for very obvious reasons, not only in Saudi Arabia and the Arab world, but internationally. So normalization with the Israelis is simply not something that gives Saudi very much. On the contrary, it's risky. So I think that the balance has really changed quite significantly. And I think you're going to see more changes going forward, particularly with regards to the Iranian file, but we have to wait and see.
Okay, Dr. H.A. Hellyer, always appreciate your analysis on this program. Thank you so much.
Thank you.